December 24th, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Feldwebel Erich Brandt pressed his hands against the frost-laced window of Barrack 12 and watched the snow fall over the guard towers. The loudspeaker had gone quiet, and for the first time in months, the camp felt still. No orders, no shouting, only the distant hum of a generator and the slow, rhythmic thud of snow against tin roofs. He had been captured 6 months earlier in Normandy, his uniform torn, his pride buried under the rubble of St. Lo. When the Americans loaded him into the transport truck, he expected hunger, humiliation, punishment. That was what they told them in the Wehrmacht. Surrender to the Yankees, and you'll starve. Yet here, the air smelled of something that made his stomach ache with disbelief. Roasted meat. Not the thin, greasy smell of a tinned horse they'd known at the front, but real meat, rich, seasoned, warm. Across the barracks, prisoners were whispering. Turkey, they said. Amerikanische Truthahn. Some laughed, thinking it was a cruel joke. Others, like Brandt, stayed silent. The Americans could be cunning. Feed them once, then make them pay with extra labor, or photograph them for propaganda. That's how he explained it to himself as he adjusted his thin blanket, pretending not to care. But at noon, the guards opened the mess hall doors. Steam poured out into the cold air, carrying with it smells that silenced every prisoner in line. Inside, tables were set with white paper cloths. On each tray lay slices of turkey, mashed potatoes glistening with brown gravy, a roll of soft white bread, even a small piece of chocolate cake. Brandt froze. He looked at the American cook, a broad man with a tired face and flour on his sleeves. The cook smiled faintly and gestured with his ladle. "Go on, Kraut," he said. "Merry Christmas." For a moment Brandt couldn't move. The words Merry Christmas from an enemy. It felt absurd, like hearing a priest curse in church. He sat at the table and lifted his fork. The first bite of warm turkey nearly broke him. His eyes stung. Around him, men who had marched through blood and fire now chewed in silence, tears mixing with gravy. No one spoke. No one needed to. The act itself, the kindness, was unbearable. That night he wrote in his journal, "They treat us as men, not monsters. I do not understand it. Perhaps I never will." Christmas morning, 1944. The camp was silent, except for the soft crunch of snow under boots and the whistle of the wind through the watchtower. Feldwebel Erich Brandt woke before dawn, his body still heavy from the unfamiliar fullness of the meal. He sat up slowly, expecting it all to have been a dream. The turkey, the chocolate, the words, "Merry Christmas." But when he stepped outside, the dream continued. The guards on duty weren't shouting orders. One even raised a hand in greeting. Behind the barracks, the American cooks were already back at work, smoke rising from the mess hall chimney, the scent of coffee cutting through the cold air. Brandt rubbed his arms against the chill and noticed something odd. Laughter. Actual laughter, from men who had forgotten how. Across the yard, prisoners were building a snowman, using discarded coal from the furnace. Someone had wrapped a red scarf around it, likely stolen from the laundry. Even the guards smiled when they passed by. Inside the mess hall, the Christmas tree still stood near the center. A rough pine decorated with tin foil stars and scraps of red paper from ration boxes. It had been made by the prisoners themselves the week before, more out of habit than hope. Now it looked alive. Beneath it sat in a crate labeled "From the U.S. Red Cross." Inside were books, cigarettes, and small paper bags tied with string. Brandt opened his. Inside was a bar of real chocolate, a pouch of tobacco, and to his disbelief, a Christmas card. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. "To a prisoner far from home. Merry Christmas, from the children of Scranton." He stared at the card for a long time. The paper trembled in his hands. Children, the same children whose fathers he had fought against in Normandy. What kind of country taught its young to send kindness to its enemies? At the next table, Corporal Ernst Keller, once a fierce believer in the Reich, grinned through a mouthful of oatmeal. "You see, Brandt," he said, "the Americans have gone mad. They are trying to buy our loyalty with cake and coffee." Brandt said nothing. He wanted to believe that. It was easier than accepting the truth, that the people he had been taught to hate were showing him more humanity than his own commanders ever had. Later that morning, the prisoners were marched to the chapel tent, where an American chaplain invited them to attend Christmas service. The guards didn't force them. Most went anyway. The hymns were the same ones Brandt's mother had sung back in Dresden. Silent Night. O Tannenbaum. For a few minutes, the wire fences vanished in his mind, replaced by candlelight and warmth. When the service ended, the chaplain stepped forward. "May this war end soon," he said, his voice steady. "And may every man here return home in peace, German or American alike." Brandt didn't applaud. He only lowered his head. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than anger or shame. He felt small, human, and utterly lost. That night, he wrote again, "If this is propaganda, it is powerful, because it makes me wish my country had done the same." January 3rd, 1945. The snow had begun to melt around Camp Concordia, turning the paths between the barracks into a maze of mud and frozen puddles. Erich Brandt stood with a shovel in his hand, his breath forming white clouds in the morning air. Since Christmas, something in the camp has shifted. The guards no longer looked at the prisoners with suspicion at every glance, and the prisoners no longer carried themselves with defiance in every step. Brandt worked on what the Americans called a work detail, clearing snow and repairing fences near the vegetable garden. But unlike the barbed wire of Europe, this fence wasn't meant to be humiliated. It was to keep deer from eating the crops. "Even the animals eat better than we did back home," Keller joked beside him, laughing through chapped lips. That afternoon, their guard, Private Thomas Evans, a young man barely 20, leaned on his rifle and spoke in halting German. "You. No work tomorrow. Sunday." Brandt nodded, surprised. "No work?" Evans smiled. "Sunday, you rest. Like church day." It was the first conversation they'd ever had beyond orders. Evans wasn't cruel or suspicious. He was curious. Later during lunch, he approached their table again, this time holding something wrapped in brown paper. Inside were 3 small books, English dictionaries, worn and marked with pencil. "You learn," Evans said. "So maybe we talk more." It was a small gesture, but to Brandt it felt monumental. In the Reich, education had been a weapon, a way to divide, to control. Here, it was an invitation. Within weeks, several prisoners were studying English in the evenings, sitting by the dim bulbs of the barracks, practicing words like freedom, home, and peace. One day, Brandt helped Evans repair a jammed water pump near the latrines. Evans laughed when the freezing water splashed across them both. "Now you are American," he said, handing Brandt a towel. Brandt smirked. "Then maybe I want American coffee." Evans grinned. "You fix the pump, you get coffee." That evening, Brandt received his first mug of real coffee since 1942. The warmth spread through his chest like sunlight. Around him, men who had once fought across deserts and cities now sat sharing cigarettes and jokes in broken English. They weren't comrades, not yet. But something was growing between them that neither side could have imagined 6 months earlier. When mail arrived from home, the letters were filled with despair. Germany was collapsing. Cities were burning. Food was gone. His sister wrote that she'd traded her wedding ring for a loaf of bread. Brandt read the words slowly, feeling a guilt twist like a knife. That night, he stayed awake staring at the ceiling. The barracks smelled faintly of soap. American soap. He thought of the chaplain's words on Christmas Day. "May every man return home in peace." Peace. What did it even mean anymore? He looked through the window. Beyond the fence, Evans was pacing his guard route, whistling softly in the cold. For a moment, Brandt wished he could trade places, to walk freely, even for an hour. But as he watched, Evans paused, looked toward the barracks, and raised a hand, not in salute, just a wave. Brandt hesitated, then waved back. It was the smallest gesture in a war of millions, but one that history would never record. February 1945. The frost was thinning in central Kansas, and the fields outside Camp Concordia were ready for early planting. Erich Brandt and 24 other prisoners were loaded into the back of a military truck before dawn, the diesel engine coughing clouds of white exhaust into the cold air. The trip was quiet, except for the rattle of chains and the occasional scrape of boots on the wooden floor. But the men were not bound. Their chains were metaphorical, a memory of captivity, not its present form. The guards at the back, rifles slung loosely across their shoulders, weren't watching like hawks. They were yawning, joking, sipping steaming coffee from metal thermoses. Brandt thought again about how far things had come since the day they arrived, thin and suspicious, in American custody. After an hour's ride, the truck stopped at a sprawling large general farm. The farmer, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with sunburned cheeks, greeted them not as enemies, but as laborers. "Morning, boys," he said. "Name's Mr. Harland. We'll be cutting rows today. Nothing fancy." The interpreter, a German sergeant fluent in English, translated the orders. The men fanned out across the field, picking up tools, digging, hauling. It was honest work, the kind they hadn't known since before the war. Brandt felt the earth under his boots, rich and dark, soft with promise. This wasn't the bombed-out soil of Europe or the dry sand of Tunisia. This land was alive. When Harlan passed by with a jug of water, he stopped beside Brandt and pointed toward the horizon. "All that," he said, sweeping his hand across acres of fertile land, "feeds people. Feeds soldiers, too. You folks back home don't know how big this place is." Brandt nodded silently. He wanted to reply, to say that he understood now, that the scale of America was something no German propaganda had ever prepared for them. At noon, Harlan's wife brought out a meal from their farmhouse, sandwiches with slices of beef, apples, and bottles of milk. The prisoners hesitated. It felt strange to eat food served by civilians, by the people whose husbands and sons were fighting their countrymen. But Harlan waved them on. "Eat, eat. Work's no good on an empty stomach." Brandt took a bite. The bread was soft, still warm from the oven. The beef had real flavor, not the stringy horse meat they'd known in Tunisia. He looked around. Even Keller was grinning, his face flushed from the sun, crumbs in his beard. Later, when the guards weren't paying attention, a boy no older than 12 rode up on a bicycle from the nearby farmhouse. He handed Brandt a small paper bag. Inside were 2 chocolate bars. "For Christmas," the boy said, in hesitant English, then added, "Late Christmas." Brandt didn't know what to say. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small carved wooden horse, something he'd whittled in the barracks during long winter nights, and gave it to the boy. "Für dich," he said softly. "For you." The boy smiled and rode away, the bag bouncing in his basket. When the truck brought them back to camp that evening, the guards didn't rush them. Some of the Americans were even laughing with the prisoners, telling stories about farming, about girlfriends, about how hard it was to find cigarettes. That night, Brandt sat at his bunk, unwrapping one of the chocolate bars. The smell alone sent him back to childhood, to Christmas in Hamburg, before the war, before ration cards, before the air raids. He broke the chocolate in half and handed the other piece to Keller. They ate in silence. For the first time since his capture, Brandt didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt human. He wondered if this was how peace began, not with treaties, but with small moments, a shared meal, a kind word, a late Christmas gift from a child who didn't even know his name. May 1945. The radios in the guardhouse crackled all morning. News traveled fast, even behind barbed wire. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. When the announcement came, the camp fell silent. No cheering, no weeping, just an uneasy stillness. For men like Erich Brandt, it was both a relief and a wound. Relief that the killing had stopped. A wound because they no longer had a country to return to, at least not the one they remembered. That afternoon, Captain Miller, the officer in charge of the compound, stood by the gates with a few of his men. The guards didn't carry rifles anymore. Instead, they leaned on the fence, watching the prisoners gather in clusters across the yard. Miller cleared his throat. "Men," he began, "the war's finished. You'll all be processed and sent home soon. Could be weeks, could be months. But for now, You're safe here. Safe. The word hung in the air like smoke. Some prisoners lowered their heads. Others stared into the sky. Brandt's friend Keller whispered, "What home? Hamburg is gone." It was true. Many of their cities were rubble. Their families scattered. The war had devoured everything familiar. Yet somehow, standing on American soil, surrounded by guards who treated them with decency, Brandt felt a strange calm. That night, the camp kitchen served a special meal. No one said why, but everyone knew. This was their farewell dinner. The tables were lined with trays of stew, soft bread, boiled potatoes, and even pie. The cooks, mostly American soldiers, moved between tables, handing out coffee and cigarettes. When Miller passed by their table, Brandt rose and said in halting English, "Thank you, Captain." Miller paused. "For what?" "For not treating us like enemies," Brandt replied. The captain nodded slowly. "You were soldiers. We all just wanted to go home." After the meal, some prisoners gathered near the fence and sang quietly, old folk songs from before the war. The melody carried across the Kansas plains, blending with the hum of crickets and the soft whistle of wind through the watchtower beams. One guard, leaning on the railing, whispered to another, "Hard to believe they're the same guys we fought in Normandy." The other shrugged. "They ain't Nazis now, just men waiting to go home." In the barracks, Brandt lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The chocolate wrapper from that day on the farm was still folded neatly in his journal, a tiny relic of kindness in a time of destruction. He thought about the Christmas dinner months earlier, about the farmer's boy, about Captain Miller's words. War had taken everything from him, his uniform, his pride, his purpose. But captivity had given him something he hadn't expected, a glimpse of humanity on the other side of hatred. Outside, the guards had started playing the radio. A slow, sad song drifted through the air. "I'll be seeing you," a song of separation, of memory, of hope. Brandt closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let himself believe in peace. Autumn 1946. The train clattered through a landscape that barely resembled the Germany Erich Brandt had once known. From the window, he saw twisted bridges, hollowed-out factories, and villages that seemed more like shadows than homes. When the train stopped at last, the air smelled of coal smoke and wet earth. He stepped off carrying a single duffel bag, all that was left of a life that had once been full of parades, medals, and certainty. The platform was quiet, except for the shuffle of other returning soldiers. Some were gaunt and silent. Others laughed too loudly, as if trying to push away the ghosts that followed them. Erich walked through the streets of Hamburg in disbelief. The old bakery on the corner was gone, replaced by a mound of brick and dust. The church steeple he'd once used to find his way home was split in half. Where his family's apartment had stood, there was only a burned-out wall with a single window frame hanging in the air. He stood there for a long time, the wind cutting through his worn coat. In his hand, he still held that folded chocolate wrapper, now creased and yellowed with time. A neighbor recognized him. "Erich? My God, I thought you were dead." He smiled faintly. "So did I." They told him his mother had died during an air raid. His younger sister had gone to live with relatives near Bremen. He found her weeks later, thinner, older, but alive. When she saw him, she ran into his arms and began to cry. That night, as they sat in a small kitchen lit by a single candle, she asked, "What was it like in America?" He hesitated. How could he explain it? The fences, the watchtowers, the endless days of waiting, yet also the warmth of that Christmas meal, the laughter of guards sharing cigarettes, the moment he realized that kindness could exist even in war. "They treated us fairly," he said finally. "Better than we expected. On Christmas they gave us turkey and chocolate. We thought it was poisonous at first." His sister smiled sadly. "Chocolate," she repeated, as if it were a forgotten word. Years passed. Brandt rebuilt his life as best he could. He became a teacher, married, and had children. But every December he would take out that same chocolate wrapper, smooth it on the table, and tell his sons the story, not of battles or victories, but of a dinner in an American camp where enemies broke bread together. He would tell them how war turns men into soldiers, but peace reminds them they are human. In 1964, almost 20 years later, He received a letter from America. It was from Captain Miller, written in a shaky hand. The former guard had tracked him down through a veterans association. "Erich," the letter read, "I still remember that Christmas. The snow on the barbed wire, the smell of coffee, the quiet singing from your barracks. I often wondered if you made it home. I hope you did. Maybe one day our countries will be friends with more than their names." Erich placed the letter beside the chocolate wrapper in his drawer. That night he looked out his window, at the rebuilt streets of Hamburg, at children laughing in the distance, and thought of the camp, of the guards, of the strange peace they'd all shared in captivity. The memory had faded at the edges, like an old photograph, but its meaning never had. The war showed him how cruel men could be. That Christmas dinner, and the hands that served it, had shown him how kind they could still become.